Hi, this is on. So people should be streaming into the room from the balcony in the break area here momentarily, and we will be getting underway. And when I say should be, I mean I told them to, but apparently my powers of suggestion have eroded. Hey, Kim, can I ask you to go round up the last stragglers from the room out there and bring them in so that we can get underway? Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if we could take our seats, we will get started. Those of you on the phone need not take your seats, but you should begin paying attention to the screen. I see another mass migration headed for the door. We'll wait another moment. So, welcome to day 2 of the 5th IDESG plenary meeting. We've had, both here in person and on the electronic link, a set of committee meetings in the morning. The one that I was in was very productive. I trust and hope that the others were equally productive. We will have more committee meeting time as we go forward in the week. If you can see the screens behind me, I'm sure those of you in the room can. The ones on the electronic link may or may not be able to. You will notice that it is a Verizon branded slide describing Verizon's identity solutions. But today, our purpose for having the slide up here is to celebrate Verizon's coffee solutions. Thank you very much to Verizon for providing our sustenance at the break. Coffee is good again today. Yes, let's have a round of applause for the generosity of Verizon. Thank you very much, sincerely. So we're getting ready to have, I guess this might actually be our first invited talk at IDESG, and we're starting it off with a bang. I'm going to abuse your patience for a moment and sort of give you a few thoughts on my own. So if I say George Alexander Lewis, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Raise your hands. Oh, we have a few hands raised in the room. This is the name of the new heir to the English throne. I bring it up partly because my real name is George and our next speaker's real name is Alexander, so we're only missing a Lewis. But also because F. Scott Fitzgerald, had his sort of Dan Quayle moment once when he repeated a line from one of his books to Hemingway. He said, Hemingway, the rich are not like you and me, and Hemingway apparently already knew this line, having read the story. And he said, indeed, Fitzgerald, they have more money. But the context of the quote is from a story, The Rich Boy by Fitzgerald, and he says, the rich are not like you and me, they know wealth and privilege early, and it makes them different. So it used to be that the famous were different from you and me also. They were always known and identified everywhere they went. And certainly George Alexander Lewis's father, Prince William, was different from you and me in this respect. But it's not clear that the famous will be that much different from you and me in the future, because it may be that all of us will, maybe not all of us, but all of our children will grow up essentially having been recognized everywhere and having people know things about them. And it really is a different experience, and we're not used to it. So what Sandy, I think, is going to tell us is, sort of the beginnings of that, right? The beginnings of the experience of being recognized everywhere and some of the implications that might have. So some of you have been wearing these little tracking devices that have been helpfully handed out by the MIT staff, and we may see what the consequences of maybe, 18 hours of tracking are in a demo later. By the way, at lunchtime, turn these things in to the table there, because apparently MIT's budget for buying Android phones isn't unlimited, so they'll need them back. So I already introduced Sandy yesterday, so I won't repeat too many elements of his bio, but I will say that one of the things that he's been really heavily involved in is the development of Google Glass, and so that should give you an interesting perspective on some of the complex problems that he's been working with. So without further ado, I'd like to thank Sandy Pentland and invite him to give his talk. Thanks.
So, yeah, thank you. So, as he said, this is, I guess, the first sort of plenary or keynote sort of thing. And I take it to be something which is supposed to break you out of the sort of mid-morning slump. We were just talking about coffee. And is a little bit fun, but also to expand horizons and show you some of the things that other people are talking about that depends on your work. So maybe a sort of a roadmap for the future, or help you think about it, and so forth. And I like this because the CEO of Telecom Italia gave me this slide, not the words, but the idea that drilling for data as a type of oil of the internet, which is something that the consumer commissioner of the EU first said, that personal data is the new oil of the internet, which is a wonderful mixed metaphor, but everybody talks about it now. Now, I have the privilege of seeing a lot of different perspectives. So I co-lead the discussions in the World Economic Forum on personal data and on big data. So the discussions include people like the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, the Justice Commissioner, Viviane Reding of the EU, Politburo members from China, but also people who are like, the chairman of Vodafone, the chief strategy officer of Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a variety of opinions, shall we say. And I do a number of other things, too. I sit on the board of several of these institutions, and actually I'm a bit of an entrepreneur also, so I know a couple different perspectives. What I want to talk to you about, go back, there we are. What I want to talk to you about is going to be about metadata, which is sort of an interesting thing to talk about given the recent kerfuffle with NSA. And the type of metadata that I'm most interested in comes from social networks, and particularly from phones. And that's sort of the theme here, is all things phones. So it's phony maybe, or something like that. Bad jokes. Anyway, so we've developed a lot of systems over the years that are in very broad use. He mentioned Google Glass. Google Glass came from my lab as a way of exploring what would happen if you were embedded in cyberspace and real space at the same time. And one of the first things that happened were amazing problems around privacy. So I'll reference that at the very end. But what I wanted to do is give you a sense of this, because this is really the discussion at Davos, is that this stuff is far more powerful than almost anybody expected. And of course, it's rooted in questions of identity. So I'll show you a couple of things you can do with metadata. So these are people moving around in San Francisco, sped up very much, obviously, The big black dots are more popular places, bars, restaurants, etc. And it looks like people are just running around there, but actually, if you analyze this the right way and you think of it as flow patterns, where do people go next, those sort of temporal patterns, you discover that there are subsets of people in there, often called tribes, that are very much like what marketers use, right? So there are people who like to party really hard. There are people who only go to the opera on weekends and don't do much else, and so forth. And those different groups have remarkably different preferences and properties. And just as sort of an average statement, which you can't hold me to, is that if you look at these groups and you say, well, what are the people like in there, you can get identification of preferences that are about 4 times better than you can do with micro zip code. So you're all familiar with zip code and demographics, the people who earn this much and so forth. If you look at behavior, you can do about 4 times better, which is an enormous thing from the point of view of not just advertising, but also government, because an enormous number of processes are based on using that data as the input for planning. So suddenly you can begin seeing patterns in there. And actually, this data is all collected anonymously. And then we go back and we ask, well, who are the people that go to that bar and so forth? So the identity only comes in at the end. But just like with demographics, there's aggregate data here, which is enormously powerful. So you can do a number of things with this. One of the things that's really interesting is that that data gives you a sense that how different people are, right? And this is a little thing that we spun up in San Francisco. You can go to San Francisco. I think you can still do it. And if you wander around for a day or two, it will build up a model of you in terms of one of these aggregates. So it says, oh, you're a young and edgy type. And then at any one point, it'll show you where people like you are. That's the red stuff. And then where people like you are going to be an hour in the future. Because it turns out people are extraordinarily regular. And in fact, they're regular enough that if you want to use them for identity services, they're spectacular. And so that's the core of the demo that we're going to show you in the last half of this talk, is that with just very few points off of a phone or other device like that, you can identify people with very high levels of security. So I'm the guy that did some of the original face recognition stuff way back in the day. This blows things like face recognition and fingerprint out of the water. And in fact, I believe Verizon offers currently in beta identity services that have a level of assurance 4, which is the highest commercial one, just from this sort of data. Anybody can do this. And the thing that's interesting about this is it's unlike most of the sort of identity that you probably think about most of the time because it's organic. You're continually re-identifying somebody every minute. Say, is this behavior consistent with that person? And you can do it with several nines of reliability. That's an enormous thing, right? So just think about that and what that does in terms of changing the problem that you do. There's a variety of other things you can do with this sort of data. So for instance, another thing that we spun up was in New York. This is CabSense. It was named top 10 Internet of Things product. Basically, it looks at pickups and drop-offs from taxi cabs in New York using GPS on the phone data because they register all their things. And using that data historically, it tells you right now, it's beginning to rain, it's 3 p.m., it's Thursday. Do you turn left or right to find a taxi? And it does a really good job. And if you've ever tried to find a taxi when it's beginning to rain in New York, you know how valuable this is. Another thing that we were able to do with this data, we have this sort of data for about 10% of the driving population in a mid-sized developing country. And we were able to analyze that for safety. And it turns out there are things you can do with this data if you can share it securely, right? So privacy, again, comes up here, where you can identify in many situations when someone is likely to have an accident in the next 3 seconds with about a 50-50 odds. And the circumstances, if you see people going down a small road and having ABS events, because remember, cars now report things like that. Not all cars, but many cars, right? If you see cars going down and having an ABS event, which means there's ice or there's something that's happening in the road that is causing people to have emergency braking, and you're now going down that road faster than those other cars, it turns your odds of getting in an accident are extremely high. It's sort of an interesting thing for sharing data. And that's one of the themes I want to point out here is that the thing about identity, the thing about this personal data is not locking it down. It's being able to share it securely. So that's an example where your life could depend on being able to share with the people around you in a secure way. It turns out if you look at those demographics I talked to you about, the prevalence of chronic disease is very different in those different populations. So for instance, one of the populations has almost 5 times the rate of diabetes of the other ones. We don't know exactly why. They go to slightly different restaurants, slightly different this, slightly different that, but somehow it adds up to a real threat to their health. And in fact, actually, we've just launched a project with Mass General Hospital to look into this in depth, because it turns out the definitions of diabetes, depression, and many other diseases are really accidents of history. People showed up with the same symptomology. They got named in a single disease. But it's thought that for instance, diabetes is actually at least 5 separate diseases. And the hope was that genomics would tell them apart, which meant that you could then make effective therapy. But it turns out genomics doesn't do a good job of it. On the other hand, what we have as strong evidence here is that behavior does do a good job of telling them apart. So genomics plus that. And so one has the opportunity to do medical science in a way that we've never been able to do. So it's not in the clinic, it's out in the real world, and it's continuous, and it has the possibility of really renovating and revolutionizing medicine. More to the point, there are applications like this now. This is something we did, and that's been turned into a commercial service called Ginger.io. And it's a check engine light. Those little devices that you're carrying around, it turns out that when people become ill, they behave differently. But they behave differently in a systematic way, which means if I can watch the stream of data off your phone, I can tell when you're coming down with the flu. You begin to act differently. I can also tell when you're depressed, when you will say you're depressed. And in fact, you can do clinical diagnostic off of this stuff, which is what the thing on the right is. This is something we did for DARPA recently. So these services that depend on, knowing who the person is, getting data, analyzing it, have the potential to do some interesting things. On the thing on the right, the little sort of triangular oval things there, what you see is something that is an interesting application where the red part is the person themselves data. So how social they are, how active and how focused they are. Those are actually clinical diagnostic features that doctors use for things like depression and PTSD. And then the blue ring around it is all that person's peers and the values that they have. So this person can now look at it and say, oh my gosh, my values are very different than all the people like me. Something's probably wrong. But to get that ring, that blue ring, you have to be able to share data in a secure way. Right? So another example where the sharing and liquidity of data is really the thing that's an advantage. Similarly, the fact that you can tell when people are coming down with the flu may offer the first real protection we have against pandemics. Currently, there are really no protection against pandemics. Yes, there are inoculations. The inoculations are no more than 50% effective. Many people don't take them. They have some fairly serious side effects. Most of the world doesn't take these inoculations anyhow, and they're different every season. But if you can actually watch people getting sick, then you can sequester them for a day or two, and potentially you can stop a pandemic dead, instead of having the 200 million other people die that would die if you just let it go. So that's a really interesting thing is, do you want to spy on every member of the population? Because the things you're looking for is their activity, their interaction with other people, their interaction with the phone. You really want to X-ray their behavior. And if you do that for everybody in the population, you may be able to save a very significant fraction of the lives in that population. Well, that's a really interesting tension between lack of privacy, and health. But it's one that we're beginning to face now. How do we solve this conundrum? Obviously, there are also things like city patterns you can get out of this, the ebb and flow of what people are doing. And many of the large telcos are beginning to offer this as a service. So they aggregate data that says, well, look, here's the population in the high street at this time of day, so this is a good place for your store. Or those guys that like drink too much, I showed a few slides back, you know, they get together around 2 in the morning in other places, and maybe it would be good to have a squad car there. All right? Not saying anything's going to happen, but let's be prepared. It turns out you can do things that are quite amazing. So this is a graph generated by one of my former students. It's for all of the councils in the UK, if you know that. Those are like neighborhoods, administrative units. And what you have along the bottom is a measure of the call patterns of the people in that community. It's basically how diverse the call pattern is. What you have along the x-axis, the vertical axis, is a poverty index or a socioeconomic percentile. So it turns out that things like GDP, personal GDP, infant mortality, life expectancy, and crime rate are very highly correlated. And so they put them into just one indicator. So what that means, roughly, is I can look at the phone calls in a neighborhood and tell you how many babies die. And I can do it with accuracy that's probably just about as good as the official statistics, because I can do this on a weekly basis. Can you imagine what that would do to government to be able to actually look at the health of a neighborhood on a real-time basis? Where crime is going up or down, where there are more or less babies dying. So that, again, is this sort of sharing of data and the sorts of things you can do with it. Now, we've done this in a number of different places. Recently, we had an event here where I helped convince Orange to release all of the data they have for the country of the Ivory Coast, which recently had a civil war. And we did this in a way that was careful. So the data was chopped up in a way that made it hard to do that identity stuff. And it was aggregated in a way that made it very difficult to look at any particular, certainly any particular person, but even particular little neighborhoods. And the data was released along in a legal framework where people were prohibited from doing various things like sharing it with other people, re-identifying it, so on and so forth. And then we invited universities from around the world to try and figure out what you could do if you had access to the personal data in aggregate form of all the people in this country. And some of the things that we found is that, for the people in Dublin found, I didn't find it, was that you could reduce the commute time in their major city by 10%, which is huge in terms of energy, wasted time, and so forth, at almost no cost. It's just they'd never know where people lived and worked. That sort of origin and destination graph had never been able to be constructed before. And suddenly they realized the bus routes were in the wrong spots. They were similarly able to reduce the propagation of infectious disease by knowing where people go and being able to set up checkpoints when there was a serious disease, and in particular for malaria. And they were able to do other things too. So another group was able to make the first poverty index for the country ever. So most of the northern parts of the country are still no-go zones. The guys with the AK-47s will not let you do a census there. And yet you can look at the call patterns, and as I showed you a couple slides back, you can actually tell how well that part of the country is going. And that brings transparency to government that is just, unheard of. I mean, they've never had that sort of insight. Similarly, it turns out that you can plot ethnic divisions. Remember, they just had a civil war. So they thought the ethnic divisions were really much more north-south, because that's where the battle lines were. But it turns out the ethnic divisions are not so much there. They're more vertical. And the battles happen to be there more because of other reasons. So it gives them the chance to be able to heal the country, because now they know where the tensions are more accurately than before. And one of the learnings from this was that by taking this data and aggregating it, and then releasing it under these legal safeguards, we had all these people all around the world working with this very sensitive data, and yet there were really no problems with privacy. Partially it was a technical solution to aggregate things in a careful manner, and partially it was also a legal solution, a contract law, not a new regulation, because remember this is all sorts of different countries, that prohibited people from doing things which lowered the rate of people doing bad things with it. So the point of what I've sort of told you is that when people talk about identity solutions, often in the back of their mind are things having to do with privacy, security, locking things down. But just as important is being able to share data in a secure way. So I want to be able to get the benefits I just showed you. You have to be able to take data that's highly personal data and aggregate or share it in very careful ways. That's the way all of those things I just showed you work. Okay, now identity is part of it. You have to know who you're sharing with. You have to be able to track them down later if they screw up. But that's really the subject of the discussions that we have at Davos and in many other places is, well, how do we actually get that sharing to happen? And let me give you this very sort of brief overview. It's almost cartoonish, but I find a lot of people don't understand sort of the history of this. The way we think about privacy today is really something of a historical accident. For millennia and centuries, we developed ways of dealing with identity, of dealing with privacy and data sharing. And they were around things like physical presence. You went to the bank, you signed your signature. In the old days, they know who you were because you were there all the time, right? And then in the 60s, primarily, things changed because we got CCTVs, we got fax machines, we got things like that, and people were really worried. And so the very first real privacy regulations were written then. And the idea with them was people were scared. All of a sudden, these things that traditionally had been localized in space and time were being shared very broadly without control. So the idea was to lock things down. And that's the current sort of situation we find ourselves in. But of course, this data is incredibly valuable for all sorts of services. And so what people are doing is they're sort of selling it out of the back door and they're weaseling around. And so that's the situation we find ourselves today, where we have really outdated legislation that dates from the late 60s. And so we're preventing ourselves from a lot of the public goods. We're sort of encouraging a lot of sort of gray market almost crime because of the value of this stuff that's prohibited from sharing. And we have to move to a new framework. And the new framework has to have something where the rights and obligations in the physical world are compatible with the rights and obligations in the digital world. We have to have the two worlds work together. And I would also say that you want them to be something that people understand, feels natural to people, fits with all the other structures in our society. And I suggested that we should begin thinking about data the same way we think about money. So the idea there is that data is an asset that you have. Your data is your asset. And you should have rights of it, rights of ownership, so possession, disposal, control. You can't actually own it. There's a lot of reasons why you can't do that, but you can have all the rights of it. And in Old English law, actually, those three rights constituted ownership, but it's not in our current legal system. And that was a proposal that started this discussion at Davos in 2008. And the idea of data as a personal ownership with ownership rights. And this discussion evolved over time. And people realized a couple things. One is that to get data to be liquid and sharing, to be able to get the public goods, you need to think of it as an asset. And the first thing an asset needs is somebody who owns it, quote unquote, or at least controls it, the person you can ask for permissions. And the only viable solution is that individuals control data about them. Okay? And interestingly, you can get agreement on this from the senior leadership of China, the senior leadership of the EU, the senior leadership of India, the senior leadership in the US. It's just not there's no other viable solution. But of course, what do those words mean? So we put out a report called Emergence of a New Asset Class, Personal Data. And this helped shape the EU Human Rights Declaration about ownership of data, and in the US, the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. And as I said, the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission was part of the group, as was the Justice Commissioner of the EU. And it's resulted in the sort of regulations that I've abstracted here, which are a lot more clear in the EU than ever other place. This is sort of the idea for sharing data. Under this idea of personal ownership of data, single set of rules, consent is required, and the right to data portability. So the main thing here is that informed consent. No more EULAs, no more terms of service. Think about that. If you want to use data that isn't required for the immediate service that you've opted into, right, then you need to go back to the person, tell them what you're going to do in clear English, and get a permission, and probably a time-limited permission, about what you're going to do and who you're going to share it with. Now, this is the focus of intense lobbying, particularly the right to be forgotten, partially because you get all these groups that mix in, and some they're extreme in various ways. But it really is quite an interesting thing, because it's these frameworks. People say, "Oh my God, it's going to disrupt the business." Well, really, what they are is they're hunting licenses. So, for instance, they give you rules for doing things you could not normally think about doing under the old privacy rules. So I'll give you an example of something that's very simple but very lucrative. This is, again, with Orange. So what they did is they spun up these secure websites for all of their customers in a region. And they gave them a list of the people that called them most often and allowed them to assign ringback tones. So when this person called me, for instance, they would hear a particular song. And those songs were typically jingles for McDonald's, or, you know, Save Energy jingles or something like that. And if I did this, if I participated in this, I would get €5 a month. And customers overwhelmingly liked it. But think what you're doing. What they're doing is they're having a financial transaction around personal data, who calls you, and this is all fine in the EU, which is one of the more rigorous regimes. The interesting thing is that those little ringback jingles are incredibly valuable. They're about 6 to 7 times more effective than TV ads, and so they're worth 6 to 7 times more. So you can, with that type of very simple thing, you can make huge amounts of money. Okay? So at any rate, people then ask, well, okay, well, that's great, but what about Facebook and Google? And the discussion is, and I don't think this is formal, visible policy, is that people who want to get into the data business include carriers, medical, banks, etc. And they have a lot of personal data which they think they can monetize, but they operate in a regulated regime. They have a license to operate. They can't do that. Except these new things give them a way forward, and that way forward involves strict informed consent and other sort of elements, which I'll show you in just a minute. And the idea seems to be that you start with the regulated companies, and you get them to be held to a very high bar. And once you show that you can have viable business with this very high level of protection and high level of informed consent, then you go back to the unregulated industries, and you say, well, guys, see, it works. Now you have to hit that bar too. And what this little article is saying is that process of eating them from the edges is beginning. In the last Davos, there was a sort of remarkable convergence. So, you know, the particular discussion was led by the heads of major IT companies, telcos, and health companies. And there was really quite uniform agreement about most things. So the idea of trusted identity, of course, is central and assumed. The idea of informed consent in what to do with data, personal data, was something that was universally accepted. The suggestion from industry was that all personal data be required to have metadata that gives the provenance and permissions about that data, and that enables automatic auditing. So in other words, the data says, we got it from this guy. He said we could do this in this jurisdiction. And he can audit that automatically and revoke the permission if he doesn't like it. And interestingly, many big companies already do this internally. And the reason is they have data which is illegal to do in some jurisdictions, legal to use in others, and they want to make sure they don't break the law, so all the data they have has tags that says who gave the permission where and what were the permissions and what are the relevant jurisdictions. It's a really sort of simple thing to carry along. That way they can ensure in their operations that they don't make mistakes. The one big battle, and it was amusing, but I can't tell you too much about it because this is done under Chatham House rules. There's a lot of disagreement about do not track and the notion that what rights do you have to know about people who are collecting data about you. And of course, the US and the EU are rather different on this matter, as are some other countries. But interestingly, they're not different when it comes to minors, to kids. There'll be very strict regulation for that. And the sort of general idea was, or general assumption was, is that over a period of time, the EU rules will come to dominate. Because you have to do that for kids. If you're going to operate internationally, you have to follow the EU rules, which are compatible with the US rules, but stricter. So companies will tend to develop a framework that satisfies the EU, because then they just have one framework that works for kids for the EU, and of course it works in the US. Okay? So we've taken a stance here at MIT to be able to develop strawman versions of this as open source software that you too can take and play with and break and do stuff. And that's what's running on the phones that we gave out. And it's a system called OpenPDS, Personal Data Store, that implements trust networks. We have examples of the legal documents we've had various experts put up, which are on the web, and feel free to take them and do stuff with them. They're good models. What they are is they're based on, for instance, the SWIFT network, which is the interbank transfer network. So that's a peer-to-peer network, again, where the code, the messages that go back and forth, correspond directly to items in a contract. And so I send you a message about sharing something with you. You acknowledge it in a particular way. That's a legal signed contract that has all the harms and remedies already specified, so you don't ever have to go to court. And it does a number of things. It has secure distributed identity. We use OpenID Connect. And one of the really nice things is we've got the Kerberos consortium here to buy into actually supporting this as a method, again, for open source that people can use. It gives auditability, and it gives distributed computing and storage, which if you get me and want to ask about what the NSA did wrong, I'll tell you something about this. One of the key things is that in this framework, we try to say our answers, not raw data. If you think about the interbank transfer things, they don't actually set all their balances and deposits to each other. They just say, we want to send this amount of money. In fact, we can cover it. We have enough money to be able to do this. So they send just the answers to the questions, not the actual raw data. And the same thing confuses a lot of questions about data sharing in other domains. Most of the time, you don't need to share data. You just need to have certified answers. And so we give you a way to do the certified answers. We have partners in doing this around the world. For instance, we just spun up a city in Italy with the help of Telecom Italia and Telefonica, where we're using this to explore not only the identity solutions, but also the sharing of data, the permissions, how people react to it. It's a method of engaging the regulators about what best practice is, and also to looking at the opportunities for monetization. We're also working with the state of Kansas to trying to do the thing here. We don't have a signed contract, but it looks like that will go forward. And with other partners to try and put this new ecology of identity and data sharing into place with people owning their own data in the sense of having far more transparency and control, and looking at where that takes us in terms of monetization, security, and so forth. as was mentioned in the beginning, we're just at the beginning of a long journey here. Even if everything that I talked about was already in place and happy, and it was widely accepted, which is, would require several dozen miracles probably to happen. Then we have things like Google Glass. That's me there on the left with some of my students and other students here that back in the early 90s, we sort of figured out that, electronics was getting smaller as were displays and batteries were getting better. And what that meant was that computation was going to be on the human body, not in the walls. And, of course, cell phones are a perfect example of that. But they're just a way station. We're now getting things that are like Google Glass that are built into your eyepieces and ears and so forth. And those, while they're great devices for being aware of the electronic world, also enable types of data sharing and privacy invasion that are new and difficult. So we're, beginning to work on that. So that's what I have to say. I did good here. I was sort of on time. If there's one or two questions, we can do that. And then what we're going to have is demos from the folks that are affiliated with my group and with Kerberos about the phones that you've been carrying around. And then we'll have much more questions and stuff like that at the end. So you guys want to get set up? Maybe there's a question or two while they get set up? Yeah? No? Sir? Okay. Yeah.
When you mentioned organic identity based on movements of the person and regularity of the person, I wanted to hear your views on how it would work in situations that are abnormal. Because ideally, I want to authenticate not only on my regular, scheduled, trivial life, but also when something is terribly outside of any previous pattern. I'm in a different place.
So the way these things are first order configured, right, are that they only work in your regular life. But they know that something's abnormal. So when you try to authenticate somebody, it comes back, this is weird, in which case you have to have backup authentication. And, of course, there's a variety of techniques for that, ranging from iris through pins through passwords. But the point is you don't have to do those very often. Because for normal life, you know really who it is because they're doing the things that only that person knows how to do, those little unconscious habits. And so you have to blend it into a system of backup authentication schemes. But it's really interesting that you can get rid of a lot of problems by having this organic, continuous authentication over most of the person's life. All right?
And real quick,
yeah.
Sure, I will, although... oh, you got one here? Oh, excellent. Hello there. I don't get accused of needing amplification too often.
Wow.
Sandy, you said somewhere along the way, oh, well, all these contracts are all built in, so everybody knows what they're getting into, and there's not going to be any dispute about it later. So if it comes out in this presentation, that'd be great to hear. But I'm interested in what the UX was here. What happened when our friends today picked up this Android? Did they get handed a piece of paper that says, and now this will track you wherever the hell you go and we get your information until now at the end of time? Or what is actually the thing that occurs between your subject slash victim slash willing participant?
Our victims, let's talk about our victims. So this is a huge problem, is how do you actually achieve informed consent? And the discussion is that there's no good way to do it today, okay? What needs to happen is there needs to be good attempts, which we're trying to do. And in fact, actually, when people picked up the thing, it said, we're going to track you, but then all the data disappears forever and we'll never see it and can't retrieve it. But there needs to develop these sort of standards that everybody knows It's like there's many things in our life that are implicit standards. You know, when you go to a store and you order something, you're going to be asked to pay. There's certain types of payment that are normal, others that aren't. It's not written down typically anywhere. It's just the habit. And that needs to happen in this domain too, where we have today's solution, which is the skull and crossbones one. Maybe we like a little trust mark that says skull and crossbones. And there's something that's like the SWIFT network, which, you know, is as good as humanly possible, and you can trust your mother's money to that. And then there are things in between, and we need to develop what those are. And it's an important problem. Anyway, I see the guys are ready, so I'll give it to them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, folks, just a reminder. So, for those people who have their cell phones, the lone cell phones with them, you know, we have collected data since yesterday lunchtime, and so we're going to have Sandy's team up here, students and developers, in a given sequence to explain to you what we have done in this demo and actually show you some interesting data. The whole demo is called Unique in the Crowd, I believe. And first up is going to be Brian, who is a student, Brian, is that correct, of Sandy? And we just have to fix up the screen resolution here so that you can all see Brian's presentation. That's okay. Display, okay. Let me just scroll down here. Oh, this is my slides. Okay, Brian.
Hi, thank you, Thomas. I'm Brian Sweat. I'm in Sandy's group here at the Media Lab, and I'm going to talk to you about how we implement secure and privacy-preserving data storage, open PDS, as Sandy just talked about. I'm going to reiterate some of the principles Sandy mentioned. Basically, we believe you have the right to possess the data about you. You have the right to full control over the use of that data, and you have the right to dispose of or distribute your data. These are important to reiterate because they influence our technical design quite a bit. So with that in mind, we have some design principles. Interoperability. Sandy already mentioned this. All of your data is stored in a well-defined format. There's auditability. User can verify what data is read and how it is used. And an important part, there's distributed computing on this data. So there's no single point of attack. It leverages data from multiple personal data stores in a distributed and privacy-preserving fashion, and it can reside, if you like, on a machine that the user legally owns. Another thing Sandy mentioned, another design principle that we have is we collect all this data. We store it in a way that preserves your privacy, and to that effect, we do not like to share raw data. We like to share answers about your data. So a personal data store isn't just a dumb database of your raw data. It's a database, a permissioning system, and a compute engine where answers about your data are constructed. All of these answers to questions about your data that a company like Facebook might want to ask have a purpose. There's a stated reason why this party is asking for this data, and it's approved by you and can be revoked at any time. The architecture of this system is 3 tiers. There's a registry server, which is powered by OpenID Connect, and it serves as a trusted identity and authorization provider. Then there's another layer of personal data stores, the actual PDSs that store and compute on people's raw data, and this is storage and computation providers. Finally, for the data that is stored in your personal data stores, we have data providers, Gmail, Facebook, the demo that you're all running, if you have one of our phones, serve as data providers that are putting data up onto your personal data store and computing on it. So how does this all relate to the demo that 25 people in this audience are running? Essentially, we gave you these phones, and if you have your own phone, you could have downloaded this as well. And it's been collecting a couple things about you. The most useful thing for the demo is Wi-Fi access points that you've seen. So we have them all around the Media Lab. Everyone, they're in plain view, and your phone is collecting this. And everybody here has a PDS if you're running the demo. It's throwing all this data up onto your PDS, and we can use this as a means of determining how unique of a signature everybody has. So we're using FUNF on all the phones. It's an open source sensor data collection framework that Sandy mentioned. And we're collecting location, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi scans every 15 minutes on these phones. It turns out that the location and Bluetooth wasn't even necessary to uniquely identify people. Wi-Fi scans work just fine. The access control on the phones using FUNF is done via standard Android permissions. So when this application is installed, if you downloaded it from the market, it's asking you an itemized list of, can we use your location, can we use your Bluetooth, can we use your Wi-Fi. This is all being thrown up on OpenPDS, which we just saw the 3-tier diagram of, to hold your data and perform the uniqueness computation. The access control here is done via OAuth 2. OpenID Connect is an OAuth 2 provider. The software is open source. It's up on GitHub. So anybody who's so inclined can take a look and download the software, do an install of a PDS and the registry server, and get to work analyzing their personal data. And that's it for me. I'm going to introduce Eve up next to talk about uniqueness in the crowd.
Okay, sounds good. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, I think that should be fine. Okay, so I'm Yves-Alexandre de Montjoie. I'm a PhD student in Sandy's group since 3 years now, and they asked me to basically take 5 minutes to tell you a little bit about the research that we've been doing around identity and mobility. And the thing is, I'm a pretty big, TV show fan. And when you watch a TV show, the first thing that they always use, and the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about identity, is like, how do they identify the killer? And, when you watch a TV show, when you watch CSI, very quickly, at some point, they're going to collect fingerprints somewhere, and then they're going to enter it in a big computer. And that's what they're going to use to identify the killer. So for a very long time, fingerprints is what has been used to identify people. But the thing is, when you think about it, it's not easy, right? Fingerprints are like images. How would you, compare one fingerprint to another? And worse than that, how would you be, reasonably sure that this fingerprint actually belongs to this person? And this is what this French scientist, forensic science pioneer, Edmond Locard, did in the 1930s. He wrote a book called L'épreuve de l'identité, which basically translates as proof of identity, in which he showed that you can reasonably confident, knowing 12 points, that the fingerprints actually belongs to a person. 12 points is what you need to compare two fingerprints. But as Sandy said, this was a long time ago. By now, all of us, and this is not going to be new to any of you, are leaving data behind. And as Sandy said, we spend a lot of time with phones, so we thought, there has to be a better way. And so what we did is very simple. We wanted to compute the exact same thing. 12 points for fingerprints. What would you need for mobility data? And so to do that, we took a large-scale database, metadata, 1.5 million people, significant part of a unnamed Western European country. And we did exactly that. We wanted to know how many points we actually need. If I know approximated place, approximated times, and this being my points, how many of these do I need to find a person out of a database of 1.5 million? And the results are actually striking. What our research shows, and this paper we just published in a month ago in Nature Scientific Reports, is that out of 1.5 million people, 4 places, 4 points, 4 approximated place and times are enough to uniquely identify 95% of the people. What this means is that in this entire database of 1.5 million people, for 95% of them, 4 points is enough that nobody else was at these 4 approximated place, at these 4 approximated time. And that's really what Sandy meant when he said, You can recognize faces, but you can also look at your behavior. You can look at the way people move around. You can look at where people go. And this is actually also what the demo we gave you, and 25 of you are actually using. It's it's a way we can wave hands and tell you about the science and the paper and so on. But at some point we need to show you the power of location. And so what we did is basically we gave 25 phones. Every 15 minutes we record where you are, just MAC addresses, which Wi-Fi are you correctly connected to, and then we compare it against 25 other people. And when it started, we were all in this room. All of you were 1 point, everybody in this room, so nobody was unique. But what's really interesting, and now it has been 24 hours. 24 hours where you guys were going to different meetings, different committee, going downstairs, going for lunch, going back to the hotel, restaurants, and so on and so forth. And just every 15 minutes, looking at the Wi-Fi you're connected to is enough to make 22 of you out of 25 unique. And this is, what this graph shows. And now, if you guys for the 25 of you with phones, if you pull out your phone, it's going to tell you who's unique and who's not unique, and then we can find why there are 3 people who are still not unique, and spend a lot of time together. And then, this is I already see Sandy waving hands at me that I have 1 minute left. So I just want to quickly finish by saying this is location. It obviously depends on resolution. It depends on spatial resolution. It depends on temporal resolution. And this is a lot of the science and a lot of time we spend looking at this. And I won't spend too much time on this graph. I think this is really what matters. And this is using this large scale database, 1.5 million people over more than a year, we came up with. And this is basically tells you the likelihood of you uniquely identify somebody using a certain amount of information. And what this says is basically, if you decrease the spatial resolution, it's harder to make people unique. It's harder to find you in the database if the data is noisy or if the resolution is low. Same thing with the temporal resolution. Decrease the temporal resolution, it's getting harder and harder because we don't really know. It's much harder to actually compare you to somebody else. But what this exponent and what this p is, it basically says that it's getting harder, but at the end of the day, a few more points, a few more pieces of information is all it takes to make you unique again. And, a friend of mine told me that apparently in retail, they say location, location, location. That seems to be true for identity. Thanks.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Arek Stopczynski, and I'm a grad student in Denmark and also visiting here in Sandy's lab. And there was a question from the audience about informed consent and what did you actually collect? And thank you very much for this question, because this is exactly what I will be talking about. And we didn't tell you beforehand because it would kind of spoil the demo. So I wanted to ask you this question right now. This is a very, very simple question. Who is authorized? Who actually knows that you are in Cambridge today? And you may think, oh my God, there are so many entities that actually know that. If you post anything on Facebook, if you post anything on Twitter, if you upload any picture to Flickr that is geotagged, and so on. But this is, of course, not everything there is. There are all those applications that you authorized to be able to access the data from those primary services like Twitter and Facebook, and they also know where you are. And this is a huge, huge number of applications. So, try this exercise maybe in the break. Try to actually understand how many services, how many entities out there know that you are in Cambridge today. Simple question. But it's not just that. When we are saying, hey, I want to authorize someone to access my location, what we are actually saying is that, oh, you can see where I live, where I work, where I exercise, how fast I drive, where do I eat, and so on and so forth. And it's awesome because this is the promise of the big data, that we can learn all this stuff from fairly simple data, just from the location data. And this is real. So back in Technical University of Denmark, we have a deployment right now where we gave 150 phones to our students. And those students, of course, agreed for us to collect the data, and we also collect the data about location. This is the plot after just few months, I believe, on data, we can actually see how the trees are planted because people go jogging. So this is the kind of data that we are collecting, and we are authorized to do it, or people express their consent for us to do it by simply clicking, yes, you can collect my location. So we are talking about doing that better, doing that in a way that makes more sense, hopefully. So something that we are calling living consent, and IAuth, right now it's in our minds in version 0.0.1. There's still a long way to go. We want something that is comprehensible to the user. And this goes back to the idea of OpenPDS, where the idea is that you share not the raw data, where you share the answers, something that the user can actually understand. This makes it more true about how the data may be used. So if you share this city, it's easier for you as the user to understand what can or what cannot be done with this data, rather than if you share the raw GPS trace. The same idea is that whatever you do, you should get the information back. You should be able to see how much of this data is actually used. And if you go to several services, you can already see it today that they will tell you, like Facebook would tell you, when was the last time another application accessed your data. But this is not quite yet. We want something that shows you in real time how much someone is actually using this data. And we want something that tells you what's the purpose, not only what kind of data, but also what is the purpose. So we want this to be a binding contract that is in business, legal, technical expression of your will or your authorizations, time-stamped, and is actionable. So when you click the button, it actually changes something in the technical layer, but also in the business and legal layers. So to sum up, can we have privacy without consent? And can we have consent of the user without user actually understanding what they are consenting to? And can users understand the complex? Is it easy to understand this complex high-dimensionality data, such as location data? And we believe that the answer to those questions is we need something better, and it boils down to the user experience problem, how we make the end user to understand what they are consenting to. And with that, thank you very much. And now, Daza Greenwood.
So I'd like to pick it up a little bit back in time from Jamie Bryce Clark's question leading out of Sandy's talk, which was really around how does the legal layer, if you will, integrate with this technology and this approach to big data and personal data. And as Arik just mentioned, we've got a certain approach we're following here, which is we call it BLT, or business, legal, and technical. All fits together, thanks to Justin Richard for some of the clip art here from MITRE. But we really think it explains how when you put certain things together, they are greater than the sum of their parts and delicious. So our approach, as Sandy was describing, is to align the business scenario, whether it's one related to transportation, education, health, with the roles, relationships, the flows, the functions, with what's happening in that legal layer. There are parties, there are transactions, there are interactions. And at the technical layer, you have actors and actions. Yet again, there's a way when you're mapping these facets and dimensions of a system out to describe them such that they can be not only aligned but harmonized, and not only harmonized but to a large and increasing extent integrated. So to pick up on Arik's innovative approach at DTU, Denmark Technical University, doing research with FUNF and some of the human dynamics tools, we've collaborated quite deeply since he's been seconded here in the Media Lab on applying these concepts to a large-scale research study there, the largest of its kind, with 1,000 students who in just days from now will be issued phones, just as many of you were, that they can use in return for participating in a research study. There's informed consent to participate in a research study, and there's some data, and so we've used that as one of the pilot examples, one of the field studies, if you will, not only of the technology and to gain the data for analytics, but also to test some of these approaches to how the legal, contractual, privacy, liability, and let's just say the policy layer can be well tuned to mitigate the challenges and really to unleash the potential of these systems. So we'll have some links available at the end where you can find out a lot more about precisely how we followed these things, how we've applied this. And we're doing very similar things in this emerging field study with Mass General Hospital that Sandy foreshadowed. It also mentions our work with Kansas state government, and we're doing some similar pilots with other governments and frankly other private sector pilots as well. And it's by doing these field studies that we get some feedback to more and more finely tune how to integrate business, legal, and technical layers. Bottom line is, what we do here within NSTIC, what we do at the IDESG, isn't usernames and passwords. It's really about these federated tools, tokenized, claims-based approaches. So think SAML or think OpenID Connect. So when we're dealing with RESTful interfaces and user endpoints and OAuth-oriented scopes, you've got an opportunity to, at the technical layer, describe what protected resources a user may grant authorization to, and you can parallel that at the legal layer by describing it in the system rules that all the parties and institutions agree to in the same way that anticipates what users will be signing, in the same way that anticipates and can be pulled from the same database for what system administrators, business people, and users click on, so that the words are drawn, the OAuth permissions, the scopes of access, the authorizations to resources that are enabled literally integrate at the technical, business, and legal layer. So for more information, we've got some URLs here that you can consult, but perhaps the most important thing that you should consult is Thomas Harjono, who's going to be coming up in a moment to talk about how we take this, I think, best of breed thinking from Sandy's big data research that's quite high upstream research and development here at the Media Lab, and have an intermediary point through the Kerberos, come on up, Thomas, Internet Trust Consortium, where this can be translated into industry, into practice in government, in ways where MIT's really been a pioneer with open source in the past, in a way where we hope we can best make them available to IDESG and our membership and mission here. So, Thomas, can you tell us a little more about this and how we collaborate? Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Daza. So this year has been a very busy year for us. We've been working closely with Sandy to basically expand the consortium. This consortium used to be called the Kerberos Consortium. As you may or may not know, Kerberos is probably one of the oldest open source security software around. It started in MIT in '87, Project Athena. It's now used everywhere. I mean everywhere. Your 401k accounts in Wall Street is relying on our code, our little code here, to actually do back-end authentication. I can explain a bit more about that if you're interested in Kerberos. This year, we have expanded our mission statement with the help of Sandy, and so what we want to do going forward the next few years is create components, software components, open source components under MIT license that will contribute towards building a personal data system, a personal data store, or personal data service, depending on how you look at it or where you're coming from. This is kind of a very high-level representation of what we mean by a personal data system. We're tagging this OpenPDS because it's basically the same design and same spirit as Sandy's design, or designs coming out of Sandy's team. We want to build components that providers and vendors can use, because that's what Kerberos is good at. We like it if you take our code, we like to use the chassis and engine example. There's a slide later on. where you build products and charge a lot of money for those products and services. Because when you are successful using our open source code, it kind of comes back to us, reflects that our model is indeed correct and also successful. This is just, again, an example. One of the things that we kind of have this thing going on in the industry now called personal clouds, where providers want to create like a data store out there where people can put stuff. We want to look beyond this because the personal data store really needs to be a dynamic thing. It needs to be able to keep copies of the stuff that I generate as I live. So if AT&T or Verizon is collecting my GPS data, I should too. My little client here, Fun client or some other client, needs to collect not just my data, all the postings I do in Facebook, Google Plus, all the stuff that I generate needs to be collected somewhere, and we're calling that the PDS store, a personal data system. We think there will be as following from Sandy, there will be a market that will emerge, organically when we have millions of people owning their own PDSs, right? That you have the option to sell your depersonalized data onto the market, either direct or via brokers. This is to be seen. And in order to get there, we believe we need open source code. Open source code provides some degree of legitimacy to a given idea because the end user has a choice. I don't trust the big providers. I'm going to run it on my box at home, in my garage, in my basement. I mean, that's the first, almost like, consent or acceptance of a given concept via open source code. We strongly believe in open source code. You can just read this. I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So you can see a whole set of slides at the KIT site. Our strategy, again, is components. We want to give you guys the chassis and engine block. You need to add the tires, build a nice body, a nice expensive dashboard, and so on, and sell it. This is a diagram, a picture that we showed in a recent trip to Japan. The Honda engine was the only engine, I believe, that participates in the F1 series with the McLaren team. For you guys out there who know what the F1 series is. And I will now just open the floor to questions, Q&A to any of us here. Maybe you can have Sandy back up if there's specific questions for Sandy. Fire away.
So I'll let you guys figure out which of you or which group of you would. The question is related to societal norms on moving data. We've talked a lot about data under the control of the subject and getting their permission. But it seems that there are certain things that we as societies have kind of figured out. So for example, if you call 911, you kind of expect that they're going to get your location. You don't explicitly consent to grant that, but you kind of understand that it's part of the system. And likewise, when you cross borders, you expect certain things to go on. So we as citizens in society have some of these things. I'm just wondering what your thinking is on the ability for us to drive societal norms so that we just know that it's okay to do certain things, like mine properly anonymized medical data for societal good, et cetera.
Yeah, clearly this is a dialogue and educational process also. Maybe, and I don't claim, and I don't think anybody knows exactly how to do it. On the other hand, it's clear that by doing things in the real world that are well-known examples, you begin to get education of people, and people respond to it, and you make mistakes, and you try to fix them. So we're talking about anonymized medical data. So one of the things, like what we're trying to do with MGH, is use this personal data concept to really rather revolutionize the way medical research is done. Normally what you do is you design an experiment, you get human subjects approval, you recruit subjects, you collect the data. let's imagine something where each person, say, in a hospital system, had a personal data store that collected all of the behavior and spending and whatever eating information along with their medical record under their control, not shared with anybody, but they could share it. And then what you could do for an experiment is you get approval, you send out a note to recruit people, and suddenly you have 5 years of data from 1,000 people, and the cost of the medical experiment drops dramatically because there's this continuous collection of personal data. And the same people can be used over and over again for different types of studies, which means you can get to things like drug interaction studies, you can get to treatment efficacy studies that today are just not really practical from a cost, benefit, and labor sort of point of view. And that's actually, for instance, the same motivation for the state of Kansas. They want to have a more business-friendly environment, but people are reluctant to share information like balance sheets and what products and who they sell to. If they had a place where they could securely share some of that information in return for the state of Kansas, generating an aggregate report that would help them run their business, it's good for everybody. They believe they'd get a lot of buy-in to that, even though Kansas citizens, they say, are rather more paranoid about that than most. And so that's the type of thing that if you get examples like that are positive uses of data, you begin to build a zeitgeist for how to do it. And I think that one of the important things is to be able to come up with, just as you said, there are these implicit standards. Probably with 911, there is some place where there's legal documents about what has to happen, but nobody knows that. You just sort of know that if you call, they talk to you, they're going to find out your location, they're going to ask you 6 questions, they're going to, and that's what we have to do around all these issues too, is build up this new sort of implicit understanding through examples. That's why we're doing these field things. That's why we're doing the thing in Trento. One of the important elements, I'm sorry to go on about this, but one of the really important elements is when I'm member of some of these conversations around policy, people think up all sorts of bad things that can happen. I like to say, and if the Martians come, then it will really be bad because, but the Martians aren't going to come. Come on, right? But that's not how policy discussions go. On the other hand, if I actually do something on the ground, and there's 1,000 people or just young families, and they're sharing stuff, and everybody's smiling at the end, and nobody died, then you can say, well, yeah, maybe the Martians could come, but we did it for a year with 1,000 people and nothing happened. And that sort of fact on the ground is very powerful.
So, Sandy, I'm going to do a little bit of air traffic control here to get us out on time. I'm going to make one short comment. We're going to have a question from the phone, Laura, so if you're ready for that, and then we're going to have Marlena, and then I think we'll go to Daza to wrap up. So the one comment is, in a small victory for IDESG procedures, we actually did coordinate the demo experiment with the phone locations with our privacy committee. We had them look at the privacy disclosure notice that was given to people like myself who got the phone. They made some comments, and the privacy terms were judged acceptable by our by our privacy policy body. So we did, in this instance, walk the talk. So we have a question, Laura, from the phone, then we'll have Marlena have a question, and then I'll have Daza wrap us up.
Yes, this question is from Lance Peterman, and he asks, who can we reach out to regarding the hospital pilot to get more information?
The which pilot?
The hospital pilot.
Oh, the hospital pilot. That would have to be me. Pentland@mit.edu.
Hi. First of all, I'm Marlena Erdos. I work for Harvard University right now. First of all, I see so many of the benefits of the collection of data and improvements for human lives. And so I'm smiling at that point. But some other things started to bother me, like this sequestration. First, we're aggregation. We're talking about privacy. But then we talk about you're getting sick. We're going to sequester people for a few days. Let me just move on to something I consider related, which has to do with the location data, and stalking opportunities. So once we give approval for a purpose, and I totally understand that, but now it goes off into this vast space of a company, and I'm wondering about the framework about tracking insiders, which my experience is it's typically done very badly. So how do we know who has done access that then leads to a bad event, and what are the penalties? And I know you're not a lawyer,
No.
but this aspect of enforcement penalties is incredibly important. It came up in the news today about elephants and ivory. There was a guy who went out with 2 pounds of ivory. He got charged 350, I think maybe euros. So no wonder the elephants are dying. What do you see as the, first of all, tracking of insiders who have access to the data, and then enforcement?
So the sequestration thing on the flu I brought up as an example of one of the hardest things. You have this incredible invasion of privacy and so forth on one side, and then you have potentially hundreds of millions of deaths on the other side. And it's I had a lunch with the vice president of the EU, and she said, no problem. We've sequestered people for, things for centuries. But I'm still not comfortable with it myself. Tracking insiders within companies, I think, is one of these areas that people are insufficiently aware of, and there really is no movement that I see. So tracking people that are not part of your company, that's something that everybody's concerned about. Those are the discussions at Davos. How do we, make sure that that information doesn't go? And that's the reason for this carrying the permissions with the data and the auditing, so you can see what has been done with the data. And if that's done under, one of these trust networks, then there are remedies that are available. Of course, you have to make sure that it all happens the right way. But, we do this with money.
That's exactly what I'm bringing up, is that just like HIPAA, there's no, you have on a company, they pay a fine, big deal. So I'm talking about once the data gets into somebody I've approved, but then it's misused, how is that tracked? How are there legal penalties? And they actually don't work low down. And I'm sorry, I'm doing a comment now, but why should a company says, yes, we pay attention, but why should they? They're making a huge amount of money. If they're just paying fines, big deal. So I'm bringing up the question of how do you incent people?
Yeah. So the question that you bring up is a general question about governance. And it is. There's all sorts of things that companies and other people do that are stupid and illegal, but they get away with it because the penalties are small. That's what you're talking about. You're just bringing up a particular example. And the problem, I think, and I'm willing to bite about this, is that we think about these things in terms of economic incentives. And those are fairly weak, as you just pointed out. There are other types of incentives you can apply in these situations, okay? And I'd be happy to talk about that, but
so
maybe
I think we
here.
will, we will have that conversation some more, and that's a conversation that we need to have in some of our committees about, what does it mean to create an appropriate set of incentives. We have one more question from the telephone, and then we're going to have Daza wrap up. I should note that at 1:30 we'll be coming back here for a series of committee report outs after we get done with lunch on your own. So, Laura, could we have the question from the
This
remote?
is from Phil Wolf, and he asks, what changes to law are needed to support the open PDS privacy and personal data control philosophy?
Well, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that, and Daza, correct me if I'm wrong, right? The short answer is that you don't need new law and regulation because this is done in contract law, right? And one of the main advantages of that is that, first of all, you don't need new laws, but it's also interoperable across jurisdictions because contract law, because of the incentives for trade, tend to be pretty uniform across different countries. And so by making it contract law, peer-to-peer contract, you get most of what you need. Now, there are a couple of things that probably need input from regulatory authorities. So, for instance, the do not track stuff is an example of something like that. Because these are people who are not yet part of this contract, not part of this trust network, potentially, and they may be spying on other people. And if they don't have if they can do that, because there's you're not on a do not track thing, or they don't have any obligation to report, that's a problem. I think for that sort of thing, at least the way people talk about it, you don't need new law, it's just new regulation. But of course, it's very controversial, and there's a lot of lobbying around it.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Sandy, and let's have the audience thank Sandy also. That's fascinating, and I hope everyone finds it relevant to our deliberations here. That was terrific, and also thanks to the rest of you gentlemen for helping out. Daza.
Thank you, Bob. So a couple of quick things. One is there will be a tour of the Media Lab. We'll walk folks around who would like to see some of the research happening here, meet some of the researchers, and people that are interested, I'd say let's just meet in 5 minutes or so by the registration table, and we'll take it from there. We will culminate that tour in Sandy Pentland's lab, where we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the tools and approaches that we previewed, that the team previewed for you. In particular, this living consent, this informed consent and integration of the legal and business approaches. Also, I want to highlight that, well, really we're just able to get the very tip of the iceberg today. There is a great deal more information at these URLs, and you can find a lot about Sandy's work at HD, which is humandynamics.media.mit.edu. For the technical part, we put everything on open source and Creative Commons for virtually everything that we do. And our GitHub account is just github.com/humandynamics. And for those of you interested in trust frameworks and system rules and contracts and policy, /system rules. And you can see some of our approaches there. And for that matter, co-create them with us and do a poll on your commit. And I suppose, just in closing, I want to say, Sandy's done really been committed, and so is MIT generally, to NSTIC. It's flying me around and by hosting here. And I think that what we'd like to leave you with is, while we're here together, to the extent that there are resources we have, or things, or technologies, or research that you see bubbling up here, let me know, and let other of our staff know, the dream team at the table, and you have Sandy's email address for particular questions about engagements that we have or work in his group. And we are here literally to support NSTIC and to support the vision of NSTIC, the result of which will enable the New Deal on data and make possible the value that Sandy was foreshadowing in terms of big data in a balanced way. So please take us up on the offer and let us know what you see here that would be most useful by way of engagement while we're together. And so with that, I wish you all the very last thing is, if you want to bubble up some questions, we actually have some links. I just put them at ecitizen.mit.edu, which is where we stick some of the legal and policy stuff. There's a couple of online discussion tools that are linked to there. And to the extent that there's more questions or dialogue chains that bubble up from different of our stakeholder groups, Sandy will be here tomorrow before we close, and so we will have one more bite at the apple to perhaps pose some follow-up questions when you've had a chance to digest what you've heard today. So with that, thank you very much, and bon appetit. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. And those of you with phones, also, give them back. And the plan is, I'm going to say, please go by the registration desk as well, and we'll try to collect them from you between the door and registration. So thanks again.